So this is a lecture on augmentative and alternative communication for students with autism. So what is AAC? Well, AAC is a way of bypassing or augmenting speech to communicate. And so if a child is struggling to communicate, we offer either an alternative where we use AAC instead of speech, or we augment speech with the use of AAC. So it's an area of clinical practice where what we're trying to do, especially in the autism population, is try to compensate for the disability that students have with expressive communication specifically. In augmentative communication for those on the autism spectrum, it's often even more important for receptive communication. So we often think of AAC as being needed for a child, for example, who has apraxia of speech. They understand everything, they understand the language, they even are capable of expressing themselves using language, but they don't have the speech capabilities. And so AAC in that case is literally just trying to bypass an impaired speech system. But for students on the autism spectrum, it's quite a bit different. And sometimes those children can have speech production that's clear, intelligible. They might be using a lot of echolalia that's perfectly intelligible, maybe even perfectly articulated. And AAC might be the way that we help them have a more functional means of communicating expressively, and a way for us to show them and help them understand what they're hearing from us. So there's two kinds of AAC, aided and unaided. Aided AAC includes things like pictures, picture exchange, picture boards, maybe a communication notebook that has different sections in it where the child can find different words that he or she needs. It could be aided communication. Aided AAC includes things like computers and tablets that have apps on them, or software programs that help children formulate language. They are also often called speech generating devices. That's the technical term and the Medicaid term. So when we ask Medicaid to help us pay for an AAC system, we would be asking for an SGD, a speech generating device. Unaided AAC, alternatively, is the use of sign language or gestures to communicate, and it does not require any kind of other piece of equipment. So there are some advantages of sign. We know that sign language can jumpstart language development in children who are late talkers and in children with a number of developmental delays. There's especially good evidence for children with Down syndrome that children with Down syndrome might be, if they have the fine motor skills, might be really capable of using sign language before they're capable of developing speech. Because in Down syndrome, there's often a lot of oral motor difficulties. And so sign language can be a really good alternative. We often see also the use of sign language or baby signs, which is not sign language per se, but it's the use of signs and other kinds of gestures. We often see people use those with late talkers. I used a lot of sign language with my oldest son because he was very much a late talker. We see that signs can increase speech production in these populations. It seems like being able to use a larger motor skill, like your hands, can have some benefits for kind of jump starting the development of articulation. Signs also give us a lot of visual and tactile kinesthetic feedback, and that's really helpful for some children. Some children are very much visual learners. That can be true of our kids on the spectrum. We'll talk about a caveat about that in a minute, but that can be true for them, and so that sign language can be facilitative in that way. Sign also promotes attention, so it can cause kids to look at you, look at another person. It can provide a functional vocabulary for kids. And so for kids who are struggling to learn language or to learn speech production, at least it can reduce their frustration because it gives them a means of communicating before they're capable of communicating via speech. It can also decrease short-term memory demands and processing load. So sign language can have beneficial effects in terms of memory and processing. So for kids on the spectrum, there can be some actual drawbacks to sign language. I think the first and foremost that's kind of obvious is that sign language really requires visual attention to the speaker. And so if I'm going to understand what someone is telling me when they're using sign language, I have to be looking at them. And if you've taken some sign language classes, you know that the kind of location where signs are produced is in front of the face and the upper chest, upper torso. And so if our sign space is kind of the space around our head and our upper torso, then that can be at times aversive to kids on the spectrum. So they might have some difficulty looking at someone else's face and be aversive to the visual attention that is required in order to understand sign language. It also requires good fine motor skills, and we know that in children with specifically children with autism and other kinds of developmental disabilities, fine motor skills can actually be a challenge. If you can't shape your hands into the right shapes to create signs because of a fine motor problem, then you're going to have some difficulty using sign. It may be that you're able to use sign, but your signs don't look like anyone else's. They don't look like the actual signs, and so then that means that other people don't understand you because they're expecting to see the traditional sign shapes. Signing requires a really good ability to imitate, and that is a notorious weakness for children on the spectrum. So sign language does not help bypass the imitation problem that children have. If they could imitate well, they could probably, many of them, could probably imitate speech just as well as they could imitate sign, if they could imitate at all. So it becomes a barrier. Sign language requires that the partners you're talking to must also know sign language. And so what I often say to when I'm talking with parents of children on the spectrum is what we want is for your child to be able to communicate with the most number of different people. And people don't know sign language. So unless you're going to be able to immerse your child on the spectrum in deaf culture and surround the child with people who are deaf and who use sign language as their primary mode of communication, you are not actually increasing the child's ability to communicate with a wide variety of partners by teaching them sign. You're restricting them to talking to only people who know sign, and to people sometimes to people who know their signs. So if they have fine motor difficulties and their signs don't look like everyone else's signs, well then even someone who knows sign language may not be able to understand this child's signs. So we also have some research that shows that for people who are not deaf, using sign language actually could increase the processing demands, because now the child on the spectrum is having to process our speech signal because we're talking, and the visual signal, the sign language. And so we're doubling the processing demands. Now they have to process an auditory signal and a visual signal. And then finally, this is a minor one, but finally, signs are not easily depicted in pictures. So if you want to use an aided device, like pictures or a computer, then the sign language user, the child on the spectrum, is going to have to learn the sign, and they're going to have to learn the picture for the same item. And that means what we're doing is actually doubling the amount of effort. The child is needing to learn the sign for the word and the picture for the word. And then if you think about it, also the spoken word. And so we're giving them 3 different symbols that they must learn for the same word, and that increases the learning load for them. So where a lot of people will say sign language is a great option, for kids on the spectrum, it is not necessarily the best option. So what do our aided systems consist of? If we're not going to use a signed system, then what do aided systems look like? Well, essentially we're talking about a communication notebook or communication board. We could be talking about charts or an electronic device. Aid can be used simultaneously or kind of interchangeably with the word device, and so we'll hear that those terms coincide. Here's an example of a kind of light tech or low tech GoTalk 20. It has 20 spaces on it. For pictures, it has a row across the top for pictures that we want to remain the same. Now this GoTalk requires that we actually stick a sheet of paper with pictures in it into the slot on the side. And we can, on this one, have a number of different picture sets. So another kind of device, high-tech computer speech generating device that you'll see is a full-fledged computer. They're small and they are relatively lightweight, but they are nonetheless a full computer with all capabilities. So the Dynavox T10 and some of the other new Dynavox devices are essentially a computer with a software on it that can help people generate language. And the software can be set up so that it's being used by a beginner user or a kind of middle of the road user or a very proficient high-level language user. And so when you set it up, you make some choices about what kinds of picture sets and words will be on there. But this device also, these types of devices also can connect to the internet. An AAC user can use the language system on the device to generate emails or to communicate over, FaceTime and Skype and instant messaging and do all kinds of things with the device. So this opens a lot of doors. When we talk about being able to communicate with lots of people, all of these AAC devices that use pictures, and especially the ones that use voice output or speech output, will allow a person on the spectrum to communicate with anyone. And so they are they open more doors for them compared to something like sign language. Print Key Romic Company has a different set of devices. I would say Dynavox and PRC are the two primary, kind of biggest device makers, although there's lots more. There's ACCI, there's Saltillo, there's just a lot of different places that make these devices. We're also starting to see basically everyday computers like iPads and tablets, Android tablets, and people are starting to use those, their personal ones, and they download some apps on there. There are some challenges with apps. Apps, when they update, will lose any kind of personalization. They might change things in an update and shift symbols around and put them in different locations, and that can be problematic for any user, AAC user, and especially problematic for kids on the spectrum. So, in addition to choosing a device that is appropriate for a child on the spectrum, another really important choice that we have to make is how are we going to represent language using some kind of symbols? And so we've got to somehow make the language visual so that the child can look at the pictures or symbols on the screen and know to pick that symbol for a specific word. And this is very challenging. We can certainly use, here they show the word yes, that would be orthography. And if a child is a reader, that's awesome because then they can read the words. And that eliminates the need for pictures. But many of the children we're talking about have not yet learned to read, and so they need another symbol system. So we could use, like the orange, real photographs of objects. Sometimes if a child has learned some sign language, we might try to use a picture of the sign itself, and that is, as I talked about earlier, somewhat problematic because it's difficult to represent signs in a picture form. We can use some abstract symbols. The last one on there on the top row is the word on. So you have a little ball sitting on a flat surface, and that's on. That kind of symbol is abstract. It can be challenging for kids to learn, but a lot of the words that we need to put into an AAC system are not what we call picture producers. They're not words that are easily put into pictures. So we have some difficult choices to make. So the symbols that we use differ in terms of their iconicity, or the degree to which they look like the object they represent. And so we have transparent symbols that are they obviously look like the thing that they are. It's very easy to represent nouns because pictures of nouns are highly transparent. The next set of symbols is called translucent, and these symbols make sense to us after they are explained to us. And I think that if you think about the sign for milk, it's a good one in the translucent category because initially someone might not have any idea why we kind of squeeze our hand together several times for milk. But if you explain, oh, it's kind of like milking the cow, your hand is on the udder and you're squeezing and pulling, and so that's the reason. Once you explain that, somebody can make that connection and go, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then it heightens the iconicity of the symbol. And the last category is opaque. These are symbols that literally do not represent the object or concept in any concrete way, and there's no way to really improve that situation. If you think about it, written orthography, print, the word yes on the previous slide, is basically an opaque symbol. it's meaningless except that we have learned what those letter shapes mean and how to translate them into speech sounds. So there are some really important cultural considerations for us to think about when we're choosing symbols and choosing assistive technology in general. So this is an article by Fitzpatrick and Brown. It comes from their article on assistive technology access and use in CLD populations, or culturally and linguistically diverse populations. And they give some examples of the kinds of things that we would need to consider with people from some different cultural backgrounds. Um, so, I think it's important for us to realize that symbols in one culture might not be preferred in another culture, and worse, they might actually be highly problematic in another culture. So let me give you an example. So these clips come from a Baines presentation at ATIA, a technology conference in 2017, and he was presenting on a type of Arabic symbols and bringing in different features of language and culture. It's really fascinating. It's about 55 slides long, but the website is there if you want to take a look. It's just really fascinating. So some of the things that he talked about, and this is literally just a few things taken out of his presentation, but I want you to pay attention to these different types of symbols that you see here. So on the left, we have the little girl and the little boy, and then we have the little boy with an X over his ear and his mouth, so hearing impaired and doesn't use speech, and then a little girl in a wheelchair. Well, notice the equivalence in the symbol system for this dialect of Arabic and how different they look. Um, when we choose a symbol set to use with students who come from a different cultural background, we can't just take the symbol set that's out of the box, so to speak, and pop it on the device and hand it over to the client. So they've created symbol sets for different cultures. And tried to be really aware of and think through the different cultural factors that influence acceptance of certain symbol systems. Another example here shows some of the problems with the symbols that we might use. So you notice the one in the center where there's a mom and a dad and a little child in the middle. They changed the symbol so that there were darker physical features for the characters, facial hair for the adult male, um, um, a, a headscarf and a burqa for the female, the mom, and then and very limited showing of affection with the opposite sex. We don't show symbols of men and women holding hands or touching each other. There are some other examples there that I hope you'll take a look at, but there's lots of ways that symbols need to be adapted based on culture. Here are some examples of people and how they might be depicted in an Americanized or westernized culture. The people all standing there with arm in arm, whereas in the Arabic symbols you would only see that in same-sex. So women can put their arm around another woman, but you would not see them mixing and doing that with a person of the opposite sex. In terms of physical features, In Arabic and Muslim cultures, they are not a fan of stick figures. They do not show skin, so we can't just have a little girl in a short skirt with her legs showing, or the little boy in shorts. So we need to adapt so that the clothing is appropriate, and certainly adapt for skin color. So even if we're not talking about quite the jump that we're talking here to a culture that has a lot of linguistic, physical feature differences, and language and cultural differences, even just thinking about students you work with who are kids of color. How do we represent them? And if all of their symbols are little white faces of people, it doesn't look like them, and that is problematic. Okay, moving to something a little different. We've been talking about devices and communication boards, picture boards, things like that. That is one way to handle augmentative and alternative communication for students on the spectrum. But I want to also talk about what we call the Picture Exchange Communication System, or PECS. This is a communication system that was specifically developed with children with autism in mind. The goal was to actually think through some of the problems that are challenging for kids on the spectrum in terms of communication, and how to kind of overcome some of those challenges. And what the picture exchange communication system does is really focus in on initiation of communication and the fading of the use of verbal prompts, because we find that children become very dependent on prompting, and we don't want that to happen. Now, I want to clarify something, because a lot of people think that PECS, they'll use the word, the acronym PECS, and they'll say, oh, we're using PECS with this child. But what they really mean is not a picture exchange. What they mean is we're using picture symbols with this child. And I want to clarify that, because just because you're using pictures does not mean you're using PECS. PECS is actually a picture exchange system. And you'll see what I mean by that. But it's a system of communication. It involves 6 phases, and it has some sophisticated features to it. If you're using pictures, you're using AAC, but you're not necessarily using PECS. So in the picture communication system, picture exchange communication system, there are 6 phases of teaching of this system to children, and we're going to talk about these 6. So I'm going to talk through the next set of slides, which show the different phases, and you could choose right now to just listen to my description of those phases, or you could pause right now and watch this video on YouTube. It's about a half-hour long, and it describes and shows you, literally shows you, the different kinds of tasks that happen during each phase. So in phase 1 of the PECS system, we're teaching the child how to communicate. We do not care whether they recognize or discriminate the picture that's on the card. At phase 1, the pictures are irrelevant. We only use one picture at a time, and so they're not having to choose between one picture and another. They simply are learning to exchange the picture for what they want, and the goal is to get them to initiate. And what we always do is wait for the student to initiate. Now we encourage them to initiate by having something that they really, really want. So we find a reinforcer, we find something they want, and as soon as they start to reach for it, that's considered an initiation of a request, right? A request that they want the object that we have. If they are struggling with that, or struggling with the exchange of the picture for the object, then we have a physical prompter that ensures that they can successfully manage the exchange. But the prompter would not prompt them to initiate. We entice the child to reach, and the reach is considered the initiation, and then the prompter can actually step in and help them achieve the exchange. We're also shooting there at this point for 100% success, errorless learning, and so that's the purpose of the prompter. So in phase 1, you'll notice in the video on YouTube that the child reaches for something. If they reach for an object, then the prompter is going to help them then pick up the picture, reach toward the communication partner, and release the picture into the partner's hand. The adult's job in phase 1 is to entice the student with something that they know the student really wants, to wait for the student to initiate a reach, and then to reinforce the picture exchange within a half a second. So seriously quick, reinforce the behavior. So in phase 2, after the child is highly successful with phase 1, in phase 2 we start moving to distance and persistence. And distance means we're trying to get the child to walk a further distance to carry the picture to the communication partner. And at this point, we still need a prompter because we need the physical prompter to help them if they're struggling. So if they're not able, if they're picking up the picture, but they're kind of losing track of what they're supposed to be doing in the middle of walking to the communication partner to give them the picture, then we have a physical prompter who helps them do that. The other part of phase 2 is persistence, and so we try to teach the child to actually gain someone's attention when the partner is not necessarily looking at them, not necessarily paying attention to them. So this is another place where we want to be very careful to avoid prompting. So if we do too much prompting or any prompting, they're going to become reliant on the prompts and not be independent. In phase 3, we start teaching them to actually pay attention to what picture is on the picture card. At this point, we're trying to help them learn that which picture they pick up is really important. So we start with 2 items and 2 pictures. And we help them learn to request with two pictures. In phase 4, we teach the child to handle sentence structure, to start making sentences like I want something. And they put, we start with the I want already on a little sentence strip, and then they learn to pick the picture that represents what they want, put it on the sentence strip, take the sentence strip off, and hand the entire sentence strip to the communication partner. So there's a little transition here to using a sentence strip instead of just single pictures. What we're trying to do here too is add attributes or longer utterances. So instead of I want pretzel, we shoot for I want big pretzel, I want red M&M. And we always add in phase 4 a delay before we say the item at the end of the sentence strip. So we say, I want, and then we wait to see if maybe the child will fill in pretzel or big pretzel. And that's the beginning. This is really the beginning of the embedding of an expectation and hope that the child will use speech. PECS actually never was made or intended to teach children to use more speech. However, what they noticed is that indeed children actually did learn to use more speech while they were learning PECS. In phase 5, we teach them to do some other things other than just initiating a request. We teach them responsive requesting. So, what do you want? I want something, and they use the sentence strip. So this is a little bit of a transition to not always not doing it in the same way as they did before, because what we're trying to do next is comment. So in phase 6, we teach them to comment. What do you see? What is it? What do you smell? What do you hear? And so at this point, we're trying to get them to diversify their pragmatic intentions and the kinds of things that they can do with language, and in this case, augmented language. We also teach them to discriminate between different kinds of sentence starters. So I want something versus I see something, I hear something, I smell something. So we're really trying to teach them to comment on things in their environment. That can be a very hard transition for students with autism because they're used to really only trying to use language for kind of the job of getting things done, getting what they want or need. And what we want to do is transition them to the social use of language, and this would be the beginning of the social use of language. So you have the link to the YouTube video that describes the PECS program. There are also a number of different PECS videos. I had a little trouble finding the first two phase 1 PECS, phase 2 PECS. Remember that on YouTube, if you just search the title here and then find a video, so My Little PECS Sweetie Pie is what you would search for, and you would find a video that's 1 minute and 39 seconds long. So you can watch some of those. There's a full hour intro to PECS at the PECS homepage, so that is another option. If you haven't figured it out, PECS is a behaviorist type of treatment. It's considered an applied behavioral analysis based program, and I love it. I think that PECS is wonderful and has really helped a lot of kids that I work with in the past. And so remember that even though we might, as I do, gravitate toward more relationship-based and developmental programs, that does not mean that there are not other programs out there on the behaviorist side of the continuum that would have merit and benefit for our children on the autism spectrum. What I hope that you realize is that our kids with autism really need us to consider augmentative and alternative communication for them, and to do so a lot earlier than we typically have in the past. And so we don't want to wait until they're 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years old and say, you know, we're just not getting the language that we want. What we would prefer is that we go ahead and introduce some AAC methods early on, 2, 3, years old, so that they have a means of communicating through AAC. And then we can transition them to using primarily speech production if indeed that speech production becomes a viable communication method. But when we wait until they're 7 or 8 and we decide that speech as a primary mode of communication has failed, then what we've done is deprived them of 6 or 7 years worth of use of language of some kind. Parents are often concerned about using AAC, and they'll say, I'm afraid it'll be a crutch. They won't learn to talk because they'll have some other method. And the research does not bear that out. The research is actually pretty clear and solid in terms of evidence that kids are much more likely actually to start talking if we lower the frustration level and give them an easier means of communication in the meantime. And so once that pressure is lowered, then they're much more likely to be capable of communicating via speech later on.